The fire hose of news from America can feel like a lot these days.
If you're trying to figure out what to make of it all, we got you.
I'm Katie Simpson.
And I'm Paul Hunter. We're correspondents here in Washington,
working just around the corner from where much of the action is taking place.
2 blocks from the White House.
And that's the name of our new podcast.
For top-notch analysis of U.S. politics from a Canadian perspective, find 2 blocks from the White House every Wednesday wherever you get your podcasts.
Including YouTube.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Cuba faces a crisis that's pushed even its traditionally survivalist regime into its most precarious moment yet. The country is running out of fuel amid pressure from the Trump administration intent on bringing down the communist government. But toppling its leadership would be challenging, leaving many to wonder, what does Washington really want as its interventionist policies push Cuba to the brink of a possible humanitarian collapse? I'm Caryn Ceolin, and today on The Big Story, I'm speaking with Canada's former ambassador to Cuba, Mark Entwistle, about how the Trump administration is upping the ante and why it might not just be about delivering regime change. Mark, it's such a pleasure to be speaking with you today. Thank you so much for making the time.
Absolutely welcome. Thanks, Caryn.
Cuba is on the brink right now of one of the worst social and economic crises. Can you just get us up to date? What has led to this current crisis in Cuba?
Well, this is a crisis that's been brewing, of course, for a very long time, for decades, largely driven by several things coming together now at the same time. The first, I would say, is of course, a long-standing policy objective of the United States to get rid of these guys. And it's been going on, as you will know, for decades, since as early as 1959, but certainly from the 1960s in various forms, and it hasn't kind of quite worked. Throughout that whole time, of course, the Cubans have developed a tremendous capacity to withstand the kind of deprivation and attempt to effectively overthrow them for a long time. And they become quite adept at survival, quite adept at developing systems to allow them to substitute and to leverage their capacities, that kind of thing. And you can see it going on now. The situation in Cuba is dire. It's very bad. But, they will, ration the electricity and give priority to hospitals. They'll give priority to schools, et cetera. They'll give priority to transportation of goods rather than people. They have a long history of planning and responding to this kind of situation. Although this one is, I think, exponentially worse situation than we have seen in the past. What's motivating the Americans right now? I think there's a couple of things, and I can come back to it. I think effectively 3 factors have all come together now in parallel or in confluence. First of all, of course, you have a Secretary of State in Marco Rubio, who is of Cuban origin. And this has been a lifelong personal and political ambition of the secretary to, quote unquote, to bring down the Cubans. He is joined by a number of members of Congress now of Cuban origin who are urging the Trump administration to throttle and strangle Cuba because they have now, they believe, the chance. The reason they believe they have the chance is, of course, because they beheaded or they believe they have beheaded the regime in Venezuela, been able to acquire control to a large degree over Venezuelan oil. Their assessment is that by cutting off that Venezuelan oil supply to Cuba, they can strangle or throttle the Cuban economy to an extent that it collapses and it falls on its own. I think probably they might have underestimated or not properly understood the fact that Cuba had been increasingly less dependent on Venezuelan oil over the years. It used to be very high. They used to import, up to 100,000 barrels a day from Venezuela. That was several years ago, though. It's down now to 25,000. Last year was 25,000 to, let's say, 30,000. That's about 1/4 of Cuban daily needs. It's still a significant piece of oil, but the idea that Cuba is absolutely dependent on Venezuelan oil is no longer, I think, accurate. But it will render a tremendous damage to the Cuban economy, without question.
Covered a lot of ground there. And I've got a bunch of questions based on what you've just told me. But let's start. You mentioned Cuba has long been under strict economic sanctions imposed by Washington. But you also said, and tell me if I'm inferring this wrong, but, the Trump administration's cutoff of fuel seems to have raised the ante a bit. How?
Yes. It is because the Cubans could get fuel from other places. They were acquiring oil from Russia. They were acquiring oil from Mexico. They were buying oil on global spot markets. They could get oil from Algeria, Iran, other places that they would buy, internationally. There's also a view, by the way, which I think people don't realize. There's a view that this oil was gifted somehow to the Cubans, that the Venezuelans were subsidizing them, because you hear this from the Americans all the time and the Mexicans. Most of this, there's potentially some which would have been highly concessional, but most of it was sold. The Cubans bought it on oil markets. But what the Americans are doing now, and what makes this quite different, is that because the Cuban economy, all economies, rely so much on fuel and oil, which goes to manufacturing and transportation, and the ability to move goods and shipping and all kinds of things. This is the electricity system and power for people, for everyday Cubans. This goes right to the core of what any modern economy needs to operate. So what the United States has effectively done, and we might as well call it for what it is. I don't think there's any pussyfooting around with this stuff. They've effectively threatened what would be a full blockade of oil by using the threat of tariffs on third-party countries who have every right to trade in oil if they wish to with a sovereign state like Cuba. By using the tariffs, they're creating a blockade, an economic blockade, which by international law is an act of war. When you seek to blockade a country for the purpose of overthrowing its government, whether or not you agree with them, and gosh, there's lots to disagree with the Cuban government. I was ambassador there for a number of years, and we disagreed on all kinds of things. It doesn't mean you don't continue to talk to them and have a relationship. But the objective now is to strangle their economy and cause their complete downfall through effectively the threat of an oil embargo. Which ups the ante tremendously and really puts the United States, to take it one step further from Prime Minister Carney's speech at Davos about rupture in the global order. Here, the United States is effectively declaring war, economic war, if not outright war, to destroy or to cause the downfall of the government of another sovereign country in the Americas.
Is the current pain that the Trump administration is imposing on Cuba enough to topple its communist government? Because, past predictions of the fall of the Cuban government have been wrong. Can Cuba, survive the Trump administration's interventionist policies?
They're in a very, very tough situation, Karen. I would never minimize how difficult the situation now is in Cuba. However, I've been, around the block on this issue for a very long time. I'm much older than you. I've been at this Cuba thing for like over 30 years of my life. And I've reached a point where, because any given government of the United States or somebody, or there's an American view or an American assessment that Cuba's about to fall, I don't put much credence in it because I've seen so many predictions that this is it. Cuba cannot withstand, this pressure. They're going to fall. Could there be some kind of internal crisis in Cuba that causes a collapse in state order and a change in government? There could be. I would argue, though, that it's equally plausible that they'll find some way in their survivalist mode to hang on by the hair of their chinny chin chins, to be certain about that, but they'll hang on. They'll manage to rob Peter to pay Paul. They'll save energy here. Somebody will come to the rescue at some point who doesn't agree with what's going on, or for their own strategic reasons will take on the United States on the tariff threat. The Russians, for example, I see the Russians are already saying that they don't care about the American tariffs because they do no business with them anyway. And you can't impose any more tariffs on Russia. So who cares? So we're considering what to do about this. I mean, that's the kind of thing that could happen, which could cause this to go on for some time. The longer it goes on, and the more difficult, though, it becomes the humanitarian situation, I would argue, the greater the pressure on both the Trump administration and the Cuban American leadership, who will start to see genuine humanitarian distress of Cubans. And as soon as those images of closed hospitals and, of hungry and starving children, that kind of thing start to move, I'm hoping that even in the recesses of MAGA world, that's not acceptable. And in the Cuban American leadership, the idea of starving the country to death, thinking that it's the leadership they're starving, when in fact it's all 11.5 million Cubans who are affected, which I think is not properly thought through, with no plan for the day after that I've seen, no planning whatsoever. It's as if, okay, Cuba's going to fall. We're going to make them fall. And Caryn, okay, what does that mean to fall? Like, what does it look like? I believe in the United States, maybe the president and others think there's going to be some happy transition, right, to some other democratic state. Much more likely is chaos, disorder, and a failed state 90 miles from them.
I wanted to ask you what that might look like if the Cuban government were to fall, because right now there's no Cuban official in place like Venezuela's interim leader, and then the government has also imprisoned most of its opposition leaders or driven them into exile. So what would be I feel like there would be a lot of challenge there.
This is what I struggle with, to be honest. Cuba is not Venezuela, number one. Cuba's a completely different place. Cuba has a more structured governance system, is a more systematic governance system. Yes, it had a very dominant authoritarian leader in Fidel Castro, without question, who I met many times when I was there as ambassador. The current version of the Cuban management system is much more managerial in character, more administrative. They have a capacity to govern themselves. And so the idea of somehow you're going to do some deal with a couple of people like they're talking about in the military or something, this is not how Cuba works. So what does it, you're right, to your question, I mean, what does it even look like? They're not going anywhere, in my estimation. There's not going to be a deal. The Americans I cannot imagine they're going to go in and try to, remove a leader. But even if they removed somebody, that doesn't cripple the Cuban administration at all because of the way they govern themselves and the way they administer themselves. So I think the American objective here is to cause such distress and such humanitarian suffering and chaos that the Cuban people rise up and throw out their own government. And that simply, may not happen. And okay, let's say it falls the day after. I've heard nothing from the Americans to say, okay, um, where are all the billions and billions and billions of dollars going to come from to rebuild Cuba? Is the U.S. government going to pay that? No, absolutely not. U.S. taxpayers? No. Is the U.S. private sector going to invest those billions like President Trump thought that the U.S. oil industry would invest in Venezuela until he was told in that public meeting that they wouldn't? No, they're not going to do that. Cuban American business elites have already said they're not going to invest the colossal amounts of money to rebuild Cuba. So, are they going to occupy the country to administer it? They already did that in the past. That, didn't work very well. Are they going to try to impose some Cuban American community leaders who are loyal to the president, etc., and send them over? That won't work. They won't be accepted on the island. Will they try to arrange democratic elections? How are they going to do that? The country's in chaos. It's there's no leader. What are they going to do? They've made it very clear they have no intention of doing that in Venezuela. Why would they do that in Cuba? So it could very well trigger disorder.
I wonder what you make of Canada's response to the current crises, because I know, the Mark Carney government has a very fine line to walk with CUSMA negotiations, coming up. But given the fact that he warned of this rupture in Davos and then, making no mention really about the aggression from the U.S. that Cuba is facing, does this not play into the hand of Donald Trump's new national security strategy and how Trump wants to assert America's dominance in the Western Hemisphere? What do you make of how Canada has approached this so far?
In all honesty, this is a real old-fashioned, something my mother would have said, a conundrum for the Canadian government. It is. I mean, in many ways, they're caught between a rock and a hard place, as you've alluded to. On the one hand, I think we're at a position where it's incumbent upon the government of Canada to manage its relationship with the United States as smartly as it possibly can, because we've got this renegotiation coming up of CUSMA. That is going to be a gong show, in any case, and who knows what will happen and what that will look like. But I think the government still needs to try to go about its business in as normal way as possible and try to get as much of a workable deal from the United States as it possibly can, and then continue to try to manage what's going on down there. So on one hand, they've got to manage the United States very carefully. On the other hand, to your point, what this torqued up American action around Cuba really is testing two things. It's simultaneously, it's in a way testing the refurbished Monroe Doctrine of the national security strategy as a kind of a real testing point. And I think the American assessment is that nobody will stand in their way. Nobody, because even the language of the strategy, if you or your listeners actually read it, it's kind of
I've read it.
It's a frightening document, actually, on many levels. But it effectively says nobody will stand in our way because we have power, we have too many cards, we have all the power. Everybody else basically has to will in the end be subservient to us. That's effectively what the document says. I mean, so you've got that on one hand, and on the other hand, though, simultaneous with that, you've got the ideas laid down by the Prime Minister at Davos in his now quite famous speech about rupture, and this is now that speech being challenged head on, faced in living color right before us, with a sovereign state of the Americas under threat by the United States, because this is exactly what's happening. There's no other way to put it. With being crushed, throttled, strangled, crushed, and removed from power. Whether or not you agree with them or not, that's what's going on. So, to your question, I don't have the answer, unfortunately. I know that it's a very tough line for the government to manage. Um, I potentially, I don't know if this is going on. Oh, and there's also, of course, a consular dimension in terms of they have to make sure they can protect Canadians in Cuba if things kind of go sideways. So there's a real national interest. We have a national interest to ensure that there's not collapse in Cuba on multiple fronts: peace and security in the hemisphere and protection of our own citizens. It may be, and but I don't know this, directly. But we might be looking at some kind of humanitarian support package for Cuba, because if the Americans aren't going to do anything, which they're not going to in their current mood, it's incumbent upon us to look at that, given our relationship. And also, we might be wanting to, and perhaps are already having conversations with other countries in the hemisphere, because what is going on vis-a-vis Cuba could easily be turned to any one of us. And we've already seen what the Trump administration is capable of doing vis-a-vis Canada. All these other Latin American countries are in now an totally equal position, frankly. Any one of them could be a future Cuba. If for some, in any way, shape, or form, they anger the president of the United States, that's the reality of the world that we're living in right now. So we may be having discussions about, and if we're not, maybe we should, about how, in a unified way, in the hemisphere, in the face of this Monroe Doctrine mood of the United States, what can we do to fence that in?
If you were ambassador right now, is there any particular advice you'd be giving the Canadian government?
I would say that if there's an assumption anywhere that the majority of Cubans are supporting the current American actions and language, I think that's a mistake. Cubans are tired. Caryn, there are some Cubans, even many Cubans, who would love a change of government. At the same time, there's a deep vein in Cuban nationalism that's very skeptical of the United States, up to and including downright anti-American. So if you were to do kind of, chats on the street with Cubans, they will have a mouthful about their own government, but they are no dummies. They would not be supportive on the island. Maybe in opposition communities outside Cuba, it's a different matter. But on the island, anything that increases their suffering, they would not be supportive of. So I think if I was advising the Canadian government, when you're looking to the future, and for a future relationship with Cuba, in whatever form it may look like, Cubans will remember what we do now in terms of supporting them in their time of need. And it's not even a vote of or what's the word I'm looking for? An assessment or a vote of confidence in the current government is irrelevant to the current government. It's humanitarian, and it's how Canada stands with the Cuban people right now in terms of the humanitarian challenge. So the more we can do now to help Cubans, the more supportive they will be of Canada's interest in the future.
Mark, I wish we had more time. Thank you so much for your insight today. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure.
And that was The Big Story. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this conversation. Send us an email at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca. Reach us on Instagram at FrequencyPods or on Blue Sky at The Big Story. If you know someone who might enjoy this episode, be sure to send it to them. You can listen to The Big Story every day on the Seeker app or wherever you get your podcasts. Maria Costain is our lead producer. Diana Kay is the head of strategy and content. Desi Nair is the manager of podcast operations. I'm Caryn Ceolin. Thank you for listening.